I can say a lecturer at the European University at St. Petersburg, because he doesn't have a permanent position now.
No, you should mention the Genoa School of Humanities.
And the General School of Humanities in Italy.
In
right?
Italy.
In Genova. Yeah. So participant at least in these two projects. And Lorenzo Chiesa will give a talk on the folic function, a transcendental...
We changed the topic, actually.
Not reflected here,
I
so
think
tell
we
me.
did.
Okay, just tell your topic to yourself, because I don't have it.
I think actually the change in topic is quite convenient, given that Keti has already talked about Pasolini this morning. I will also be talking about Pasolini, but more specifically...
Pasolini and the anthropological genocide.
Yes, the notion of anthropological genocide, because I'm really interested in seeing how, and you'll see my paper as I develop, Pasolini switches from what is apparently a very humanist position, neo-realist humanist, to a totally anti-humanist, arguably, position in what is his final and most problematic film, Salò. But I will try to actually look at how Pasolini, right before dying, he was killed in 1975, in the last 3 or 4 years of his life, he produced a consistent body of political and sociological works, which then led to Salò. Most of you have seen Salò, but Salò was a metaphor of a kind of assessment, sociological and political assessment that Pasolini carried out in the last few years of his life. So, well, and also like we had a bit of a mess with the introductions, but I want to actually not to forget to thank Keti for her kind invitation, and also the National Center for Contemporary Arts for hosting us in this beautiful building. I mean, nobody said it, but I found it very, very attractive, the building itself. It's really nice. So, throughout his very late writings on politics and culture, Pierpaolo Pasolini sketches a desolate history of post-World War II Italian society. He believes that after the economic boom facilitated by the Marshall Plan of the 1950s, Italy entered an age of devastating consumerism, he says. This corresponded to what he calls a loss of reality. So consumerism, loss of reality. The epitome of which, loss of reality, is represented by the cultural crisis of 1968, so very controversial. 1968 is the height of a crisis, not the beginning of something new. More specifically, during the late 1960s, Pasolini believes two kinds of subculture openly confronted one another. That of the merging technocratic bourgeoisie of late capitalism, and that of the young people protest. Pasolini's condemnation of the events of 1968 is convoluted, but it could be, in my opinion, reduced to a single hypothesis. That is, the cultural elite of the new generation began to live existentially, by means of a violent anti-Oedipal critique of fathers, a series of values that he was not later able to define rationally. In primis, those derived from the vague notion of extremism. These values, according to Pasolini, the values of the 1968 bourgeois protesters, these values remained, as he emphasizes in a quite nice pre-Badiousian way, without a name, he says. These values remain without a name. So there is an event, 68, but there is no naming of the event. These values remain without a name, and those obliged the 1968 generation to adopt the technical discourse of late capitalism. There's a very nice article where he attacks Potere Operaio and Negri, saying that they speak like American sociologists. That's quite an interesting thing.
Pasolini?
Yes. Despite the fact that diagnosis of society made by the 1968 extremists was substantially correct, Pasolini contends, their linguistic vulgarity, which consisted first and foremost of an endless iteration of political commonplaces, was tantamount, he says, to joyfully barking and wagging the tail at the new masters, quite similar to the assessment of Lacan has of 1968. The revolution is not a radical change, but it's actually going back to a restoration. So, in the end, the failed revolution of 1968, according to Pasolini, ultimately contributed to the only really existing revolution, that of the bourgeoisie, that transforms all human beings into bourgeois through the new rules of media and consumption. In the midst of such a cultural crisis and its dissociative effects, Pasolini was initially able to identify the last vestiges of reality in the body, the concrete body, of the young people of the lower classes, especially the lumpen proletariat. And this was possible, he believed, insofar as the lower classes were still alien to the bourgeois culture of the ruling class. In other words, and I quote Pasolini, the lower classes, especially the lumpen proletariat, were still almost completely in possession of their physical reality and the cultural model that was directly derived from it. End of quote. This motif, of course, is clearly present in his early neorealist films of the 1960s, Accatone, Mamma Roma, but it still underlies the historical films of the so-called trilogy of life, 1971-74. So the historical film, the adaptation of Chaucer, the Arabian Nights, and the Decameron. In them, Pasolini says, I aimed at representing explicitly the corporality of poor people through what I deemed to be its symbol, that is to say, the naked body and sex. In so doing, he intended, and he says it very clearly, to provoke three different sections of the public of the late 60s, early 70s. And this in order, he says, and this is important in my argument, in order to enhance the right of expression, the right to expression, and sexual liberalization. So here, Pasolini still believes is making a movie to enhance the right to sexual liberalization, and we'll see how Salò is completely opposite. So the three different sections of the public intended to provoke are, one, he calls them the conformist petit bourgeois, who were not provoked in the least, he says. They didn't give a shit, basically. Two, the intellectual critics who foreclosed, like Italo Calvino, Roland Barthes, who was corresponding with Pasolini in those times, the intellectual critics who foreclosed the political statement about these films, about bodies and sex as a political form of resistance to capital, and those they deemed these works to be basically meaningless. And third, and this is maybe the most clear object of polemic in Pasolini with this film, the leftist, what he calls the leftist moralizers, especially what he calls the feminist vestals, who were, he says, as indignant at what they saw, for instance, in the Decameron, as the fascist vestals of tradition, because they both associated these films with pornography. Now, and here is the change, here is the anthropological genocide. However, in his subsequent and well-known 1975 essay, Abjuration, so refusal, rejection from the trilogy of life, Pasolini declares that he has come to hate bodies. And then he articulates this argument. So he just says, I hate all bodies. The latest Pasolini abjures his earlier work insofar, he says, as it asserted the innocence of the lumpen proletarian and or the exotic body. Pasolini now believes that the hedonistic consumerism and sexual promiscuity imposed by the techno-fascist power of late capitalism necessarily entails what he calls an anthropological genocide. This is concomitant with a degeneration of all bodies, independently of their social class, so lumpen proletariat are included, and geographical provenance. Pasolini, of course, was flirting a lot with the Middle East. He traveled extensively, so there was also another discussion about how lumpen proletariat was also a vestige of the past for Pasolini, and this is also very problematic, of course. Although he states that he doesn't regret having shot the trilogy of life, Pasolini rejects it. He forsakes the principle that it expressed, or better, he realizes that they are no longer politically valid. It is worth quoting his argument in full. I think this is the crucial passage about anthropological genocide, which will then articulate in my own words more thoroughly. So, quote, first, the progressive fight for expressive democratization, Pasolini says, and sexual liberalization has been brutally overcome and frustrated by the consumerist power's decision to bestow a wide and false tolerance. Second, that's the second thesis he puts forward, even the reality of innocent bodies has been violated in this way, manipulated and tampered with by the consumerist power. Indeed, such violence against bodies has become the most glaring fact of a new human epoch, end of quote. And this is why when I teach courses on biopolitics, I start from Pasolini, because I think this is already biopolitics in which at least Italian critique of biopolitical thought. From these two theses Pasolini promulgates very openly, I want to derive 5 corollaries, which are also very closely related to minor texts he wrote in those years. First corollary. According to Pasolini, the tolerance bestowed by the new consumerist power is essentially repressive. So it's a repressive form of tolerance. No man, according to him, was ever forced to be as conformist as a consumer, insofar as no ruling power has ever had so many possibilities to create human models and to impose them on people by way of media. He makes this point very clearly. The new power thus represents what he calls a total form of fascism that is nevertheless, this is interesting, think of Agamben, not as yet embodied by a specific political entity, but rather subsists in a state of anomie. So, radical state of exception which associates with a new form of technocratic fascism, but at the same time, it is not embodied in a specific political entity. You mentioned the catacomb. I think Agamben knows that, and he makes a reference to Salò precisely in The Kingdom of the Glory. And also think in terms of sociological critique of Italy, a total form of fascism, mass mediatic fascism, which is not embodied by a specific political entity, but entails a state of anomie. I mean, this is like Berlusconi, in a way. You know, like if you look at concrete political example, it's a beautiful anticipation. So I go to this second corollary. Second point I make from Pasolini. The model imposed by the new power, the new technocratic fascist power of consumerism in the field of sexuality precisely, consists of a moderate sexual freedom, Pasolini says, that, quote, includes the consumption of all the surplus that is considered necessary for a modern couple, end of quote. Put differently, the injunction to emancipate oneself sexually goes hand in hand with the injunction to consume the economic surplus. The neo-fascist biopolitics of late capitalism is thus, for Pasolini, first and foremost, a way of controlling politically the economy. Most leftists, he believes, that is to say the old intellectuals of the resistance generation, the feminists, the youngsters of the far left, extra-parliamentary groups, most leftists are unable to acknowledge, and I think this is still quite topical, are unable to acknowledge that such a change took place thanks to a falsification of their own liberal values, which have consequently become counterproductive. And there's also an element of self-critique. Remember, first you have like a call for sexual liberalization and right to speech, etc., etc. So, you know, basic Western liberal values, and then you have this sudden reversal. Why? Again, because if he believes that these are precisely the values that the new form of biopolitical fascism has incorporated in its false tolerance. Third corollary, Pasolini believes that the pervasive status quo imposed by this new power works retroactively. As he puts it, quote, today, the degeneration of bodies and sexes has assumed a retroactive value. If those who then were that have today become this and this, it means that they were already so potentially, he says. Hence, even their way of being in the past is devalued by the present. So, no nostalgia in a way. The collapse of present culture and the concomitant degeneration of bodies necessarily involves the collapse of past culture and past bodies. There's no way of rehabilitating the young, beautiful bodies of Akatone, etc., etc. It's a really important point because it prevents a certain sort of criticism which sees in Pasolini a reactionary, regressive idealization of the peasant or lumpen proletariat past. There is no idealization of the past, or at least there is an awareness that it is not possible to go back in time politically. Pasolini's transtemporal condemnation is at the same time trans-class and trans-geographical. since the lumpen proletarian body and the exotic body were considered as an objective survival of the past. In other words, quote, the lower classes achieved the loss of their body with a short delay, end of quote. Fourth point I'm deriving as a corollary to Pasolini's biopolitical thesis, the principal symptom of this anthropological genocide, which is universal by now, that caused the demise of popular culture and the derealization of the body of the lower classes is this principal symptom, neurosis. I quote Pasolini, a kind of society that is tolerant and permissive is the one in which neuroses are most frequent, insofar as such a society requires that all the possibility it allows be exploited. That is, it requires a desperate effort so as not to be less than everybody else, in a competitiveness without limits. And here again, it's a quite straightforward sociological criticism, but it anticipates, I think, quite well a Lacanian tenet which has been sociologically and politically derived by Slavoj Žižek. This is like the injunction to enjoy. So, you know, if you look back at Pasolini from now, it all seems like, you know, current critique of the ideology have moved much faster and much beyond. But we have to remember we are here in the early 70s, you know. So the possibilities offered by a tolerant society are for Pasolini both economic and sexual. Hedonistic ideology creates the illusion that unnecessary goods as well as unconstrained sex are easily available and thus must be consumed. The frustration that follows the impossibility of enjoying this surplus causes both unhappiness and violence, especially among the lower classes. Young proletarians, those turn for Pasolini into what he calls miserable neurotic erotomaniacs. So we move from the aestheticization of the lumpen proletariat body with, you know, like a tone like Bach as a soundtrack to, in 15 years, miserable neurotic erotomaniacs who live, he says, in an aggressive environment in which the mass is criminal. Then he specifies such an environment is reminiscent of Germany at the dawn of Nazism. Fifth and last point I want to make about anthropological genocide, and then we'll move on. I think the ethical degeneration of culture, I think it's really quite clear in Pasolini's text of these years, the ethical degeneration of culture is paralleled by a specific aesthetic degeneration of the body. So this is not just ethical, this critique, but also aesthetical. Neurosis, of course, is by definition psychosomatic, and for Pasolini, in the Italy of 1975, in which he writes, ugliness reigns supreme. Besides promoting new psychological traits, the anthropological genocide of popular culture created a new race, Pasolini provocatively states. He baptizes this monster, quote, somatized ideological hooliganism, which is a bit of a condensation of what I've been talking about. It's really beautiful. Somatized ideological hooliganism. For some time, he says, during the years of the economic boom of the 50s, late capitalism deluded us into believing that the conquest of medicine and an improved diet were paving the way for a better, stronger, taller human race. But this was just a brief illusion, since it is now clear, Pasolini believes, that the new generation is infinitely weaker, uglier, paler, and sicker than all other generations one can remember. In his late political writings, very late, Pasolini seems to understand this degeneration primarily in terms of what he calls, and I'll return to this point, which is important, a lack of expressiveness of the youngster's body. He says, quote, there's no light in their eyes, their lineaments are like the forged lineaments of automata, they do not know how to laugh or smile, end of quote. So it seems to be an aesthetic ugliness revolving around expressivity. Yet, some passages of his brutal and unfinished novel, Petrolio, leave no doubt that this physical ugliness of the new generation can also be objectified into specific organic deformities. Here he speaks of obesity, bandy legs, being excessively short or lean, having flattened or misshapen noses, having huge mouths and prominent teeth, and so on. Now, According to Pasolini, this degenerative ugliness of the body of the new generation of late capitalism is epitomized by the youngster's hair. I quote, "Among all the physical defects of the lucky ones who have been gifted by nature with a certain amount of ugliness and repugnance, the hair has a great importance in the guise of mustaches, birds, sideburns, fringes, curls, ponytails, and other guises which earlier civilizations did not have a name for," end of quote. In a well-known article of 1973, Pasolini delineates the involution of the political meaning of the so-called capellonismo, having long hair. So I will say more about this, but basically it's a metaphor for the end of the left, in a way, and how this discourse, which he understands structurally in a Saussurian manner, Barthesian Saussurian, turned from being a left-wing discourse to a profoundly right-wing discourse. So initially, around 1966-67, he writes, "The exclusively physical discourse of long hair was clearly a leftist discourse and conveyed the following silent message." I quote Pasolini, "The bourgeois are right when they," and it's the hair that speaks, right? So the bourgeois are right when they look at us with hatred and terror, since that in which the length of our hair consists challenges them in an absolute way. But they should not regard us as impolite and savage people. We are well aware of our responsibilities," end of quote. However, after the facts of 1968, hair grew longer and started to speak too much, profusely. Verbalism became the new ars rhetorical revolution, Pasolini says. And he also adds, "Gauchism is the verbal disease of Marxism." Long hair kept on making leftist statements, so we're at the second stage, but their leftism became increasingly irrationalistic. Their privileging of action over rationalization, subcultural, and already substantially right-wing. Finally, third stage, involution of the discourse of hair. By 1972, the discourse of long hair turned, Pasolini believes, into a distinctly reactionary discourse. Pasolini recalls a recent visit to Persia. Pasolini recalls a recent visit to Persia. Quote, it's a beautiful quote. "This September, I was in the small city of Isfahan in the heart of Persia. Persia is an underdeveloped country, as one horrendously says, but its economy is rapidly taking off, as one says, in a likewise horrendous way. One night, I was walking through the main street when I saw two monstrous beings among all those ancient, beautiful boys, full of an ancient human dignity. They were not really cappelloni, guys with long hair, but their hair was cut in a European fashion, long at the back, short at the front, straw-like, artificially stuck around the face, with two filthy tufts over the ears. What was this hair saying?" Still quoting. "It was saying," and now he quotes the hair, "We do not belong to this mass of wretched creatures, underdeveloped poor fellows who were left behind in a barbarian age. We are clerks in banks, students, sons of people who grew rich and work in the oil companies. We know Europe. We have read a lot. We are bourgeois. And here is our long hair that bears witness to our international modernity of privileged people," end of quote. So, how to put together anthropological genocide and having long hair? I think for Pasolini, the political involution from left to right of having long hair overlaps perfectly with the last phases of the anthropological genocide. More precisely, the trajectory of the discourse of long hair represents a metaphor of the impasses of the 1968 movement. In the long run, the existential without a name revolution of 68 served only the reproductive apparatus of tolerant late capitalism, and as a consequence of this, facilitated the creation of a total cultural model that is now imposed worldwide on all social classes and all pseudo-political orientation. I quote Pasolini, "Today, nobody could ever distinguish a revolutionary from a provocateur by way of his physical appearance. The right and the left are fused physically." And also, quote, "People are all exactly the same according to a cross-class code. Student equals factory worker. Left equals right. everybody has long hair. End of quote. The originality of Pasolini's stance lies, in my opinion, especially in the fact, and this is quite beautiful, that he closely associates his critique of long hair with a critique of the new habit of quoting from the haircut styles of past decades, or even historical ages. Beautiful quote. This is from Petrolio, the unfinished novel. He writes, there are those who have abundant, and it's all about male hair, right? I mean, he's criticizing, I didn't specify that, but I thought it was implicit. There are those who have abundant, swollen hair, perfectly set, and similar to the perm that was popular with ladies in the 40s during fascism. Others unintentionally quote even more distant eras, the 20s or early 30s. Their hair falls smoothly on both sides, on the forehead, while over the forehead there is a small, long, and accurate fringe. Still others whose hair is without resources have let it to grow wild. But it falls in extremely black and disheveled locks, the exact hair of a neorealist hooker from the 50s. There are also those who quote men rather than women. That is, they quote great men of the past who are completely unknown to them. Christ, Cavour, a reactionary intellectual of the 18th century, a judge portrayed by an anonymous neoclassical painter, end of quote. Pasolini does not explicitly refer here to the notion of postmodernity, but I think this is clearly what is at stake ante litteram in his argument about quoting haircuts from the past. In his late writings, he repeatedly insists on the fact that the anthropological genocide inflicted on the new generation and made flesh by the ugliness of long hair and other somatic traits should be conceived as a complete change which stands for the end of history as we've known it so far, if not the end of history tout court. From the standpoint of political economy, this means that for the first time in history, the new techno-fascist power of late capitalism produces a kind of social relation between the classes that is unchangeable, Pasolini believes. In other words, these relations exclude once and for all any form of social alterity, the possibility of inventing a different set of social relations or discourse. So in a way, like the universalization of the discourse of long hair is a totalization of a certain late capitalist discourse, which for the first time seems not to permit any kind of change. Of course, this is a problematic argument. I mean, I'm not defending it. I'm trying to show the consistency of what he's saying, and then one has to criticize it from the outside. So the obliteration of the culture of the lower classes is far from overcoming the unfavorable economy to which they are subjected. On the contrary, such an obliteration enhances the alienation of their labor precisely in that it imposes a hedonistic and tolerant cultural model. I think this is really, really close to Slavo's point he makes about civil rights and human rights. Pasolini believes that insofar as consumerism is cynically intertwined with a false realization of civil and human rights for all, class struggle is foreclosed. He says it very, very clearly. So this focus on human rights and civil rights is a way to foreclose class struggle, and it is immensely successful. A proliferation of different cultural quotations from the past, remember the haircuts, then seems to have the function of masking what is really the eternal repetition of the same social model, the definitive fixation of the everlasting exploitation of the proletariat, now rendered petit bourgeois in a universal way. I have still 2 points to elaborate. I wanted to know how I'm doing with time.
We still have time.
Good.
10 minutes.
Good. Now, according to Pasolini, this anthropological genocide that is concomitant with the irreversible triumph of economic inequalities should also be conceived literally as an extermination of the logos of man. So the anthropological genocide is also a genocide of logos. He believes, in fact, that young people are becoming aphasic. Quote, they are unable to invent metaphors and real linguistic movements. They mumble, push each other, or guffle. They let out guttural cries. He makes lists of these guttural cries. They let out guttural cries and obscene interjections. End of quote. Expressive language, imprimis dialects and jargons, which used to be regenerated by continuous inventions,
is being replaced by the inexpressive communication provided by the body qua sign, which is silent or conformist, as the case of long hair proves. So you have two notions of language based on roughly on structural linguistics, but you have on the one hand expressive language, it's more complex, but to simplify the argument, and on the other hand inexpressive communication. Expression, Pasolini claims, is eternally changing and implies the possibility of an infinite interpretation insofar as it is the effect of signification produced by the openness of signifiers. The fact that no signifier refers to just one signified. On the contrary, the technical pragmatism of communication relies on the bionivocal relationship between a sign and a referent, which reduces human language to an animal code and turns faces into masks. Communication is the language, Pasolini says, of applied science and business. It is thus not surprising that the linguistic canon that is in force within factories tends to spread also outside of them, insofar as the producers want to establish an absolutely clear business relation with those who consume. Advertisements on television, whose pragmatic language is physico-mimetic, the language of behavior that promotes a corporeal model, enact this propagation. I mean, this is all not new under the sun for us. But think about this kind of sociological political analysis of advertisements. I mean, some of these articles go back to the mid-60s. Pasolini, this is just a brief parenthesis, and then I go to the conclusion. I have just a couple of pages of conclusion. Pasolini was obsessed by an advertisement about a pair of jeans whose name was Jesus. I mean, you should read that. I mean, it's a beautiful analysis of the death of God via the naming of a pair of Levi's jeans, I think. It was like a brand of sexy Levi's jeans called Jesus. Now, I move to my final considerations. I'd like to conclude with some thoughts on Pasolini's infamous film Salò and how they relate with what I've said so far. I think Salò is an attempt at actually creating a new idea of the left, very roughly speaking, but it's a political impasse. And Pasolini realizes it. It is a totally anti-humanist and catastrophic apocalyptic film. In his revealing interview with Bachmann, which you can find on the internet, Pasolini brutally admits that one of the main objectives of his film Salò was, he says, not to humanize, i.e. to dehumanize, the young victims tortured and killed by the fascist sadists. He also says, I have not shown victims whose side the viewers could be on. In this, I'm also very true to this ad. I do not believe in pity, end of quote. Pasolini's writings of the same years repeatedly return to the question of the ambiguous relationship between the torturer and the victim. He says, all of the torturer's intentions are suggested by the gaze of the victim. In Petrolio, the unfinished novel, he even comes to the conclusion that there is a peculiar total passivity in the body of those who are tortured or sentenced to death, an immobile obedience of the body that almost seems, he says, to offer itself to the torturer, and those approve the latter's actions. In this context, Pasolini makes very controversial reference to what he calls the poor tiny bodies of the Jews at Dachau and Mauthausen. So it's incredibly problematic.
Puritanic bodies? Which kind of, I didn't...
Poor tiny bodies of the Jews.
Poor...
So he's basically suggesting that even in the context of the Holocaust, the victim was offering himself and participating in.
What's the word you used? I didn't...
Poor, tiny.
Poor tiny.
Poor tiny bodies. Mm-hmm. Now, what does the guilty body of the victims of Salò stand for? I think this is the question we should ask watching the film. What is the relation of these victims to Nazism and the Holocaust? Pasolini openly concedes that he is not, quote, really linking the action in a direct way with the Republic of Salò. Of course, Salò was the center of Nazi-fascist Italy after 1943, the capital of the second regime established by Pasolini thanks to Hitler. So he says, I'm not really linking the action in a direct way with the Republic of Salò. So he claims that his film is not directly related to the Nazi fascism of the Second World War. Rather, he says, I am referring to the young people in 1975, those of the Anthropological Genocide. Salò is a representation of what we have been living in recent years, I'm paraphrasing closely. Namely, he says, the regimentation imposed by the hedonistic ideology of late capitalism. Salò is thus a metaphor for how contemporary pseudo-capitalist power imposes sex and consumerism, or better, the consumerism of sex, on young people who in the end do not disdain it, and who thus all turn into little sads in order to satisfy their hedonistic demands. In other words, the young victims' bodies of Salò are guilty of enjoying compulsory sex. So you see the connection with the sociological argument. With regard to the plot of Salò, we should think especially of how by the end of the film, towards the end of the film, some, if not most of the young victims enjoy having sex and for this reason become informers. This is particularly the case with the lesbian couple, Eva and Antinesca, who report the misdeeds, if you remember the film, of Ezio, the communist servant, and the black maid. Pasolini nonetheless refers to historical Nazi fascism because he believes that the young people, as we've seen, of the early 70s, underwent an anthropological genocide that is comparable with a Holocaust, and out of which Holocaust, a new army of SS emerged. So here the argument is the dialectical argument whereby if you want to compare what is going on in 1975 in Italy with biopolitical hedonism with what happened in Germany at the dawn of Nazism, in a sense, this anthropological genocides make so that the young people are both the victim of a Holocaust, out of which a new army of SS emerges. You see, like this is the kind of dialectical analysis he makes. Thus, the new generation, especially the youngsters of the lower classes, rapidly passed from the role of victim to that of executioner. After they were forced to abandon their cultural values, pauperian values, we could say, their frustrated attempt to adapt to petit bourgeois schemes enhanced their cruelty. This is precisely what happened 50 years earlier with the SS, Pasolini says. Any attempt to deny the possibility of a repetition in a new historical context of Nazism raised to power and of everything that followed from it, any attempt to isolate the uniqueness of the Holocaust amounts to expressing a, quote, a form of racism against Germans. Despite the fact that the 1945 Nazism depicted in the film should be conceived as a metaphor for 1975 neo-Nazism, Pasolini resolutely also aims to historicize Sade's ahistorical fantasies. Both 1945 and 1975 are significant years for him. 1975 is, however, in a sense a repetition of 1945, but 1975 is clearly a more significant year than 1945, since for Pasolini, and this is where we can open a debate in a minute, 1975, as depicted in Salò in a way through a metaphor, as described sociologically and politically in these writings, is the year of the end of history. Pasolini, and this is the contradiction, I think, in like Pasolini. Pasolini, thus, contradictorily attempts to historicize the end of history. He contradictorily attempts to historicize the complete aphasic animalization of man carried out by the biopolitics of late capitalistic hedonistic ideology. In so doing, he absolutizes the uniqueness of one specific moment in history and commits the very mistake he was warning us against when condemning a certain interpretation of the Holocaust. Following Zizek's critique of Foucault and Agamben, one could well suggest that those who consider the notion of biopolitics, standard political, biopolitics, whatever you want to call it, as the culmination of the entirety of Western thought and the genocides of 20th century as a negative teleological endpoint of the entire history of the West, those who believe that tacitly accept the preclusion of the very possibility of the emergence of a new political subjectivity. And I think here the problem with Pasolini is the problem for most post-workerist thought and a lot of Agamben. So again, I'm using Pasolini as a kind of like naive precursor of more philosophical discussions we are having. This impasse seems to evidence all the difficulties involved in the programmatic statement that Pasolini intended to make with Salò. The film, he claimed, had to initiate a thorough rethinking of political engagement, a new activism opposed to the late capitalistic, cynical recuperation of the progressive liberal themes of the old leftist activism. Judging from a series of articles of the same period, this new activism, the metaphor of which should be Salò, needed to formulate first and foremost in the fields of art and literature a constructive notion of communicative language. So remember, before we said that in a way anthropological genocide goes together with prevalence, actually an obliteration of expressive language operated by communicative language. Now, what is the objective, the aesthetical political objective of Salò, according to Pasolini, to promote a constructive notion of communicative language, to find expression within quasi-aphasic, semi-animal communicative language. Reacting against the abusive use of the expressivity of the naked body and innocent sex perpetuated by the new power, you see the dialectic? I mean, if the new power, the false tolerance, hedonistic false tolerance of the new power uses the expressivity of the naked body, which he deemed to be innocent, to actually promote a certain ideological agenda, then aesthetically one has to find a new form of expressivity. So reacting against the abusive use of the expressivity of the naked body and innocent sex perpetuated by the new power, Pasolini intended to explore the unexpected possibility of making the language of the technological world expressive. Word. Technological word. Le monde. It's word. I think I pronounced it correctly. This could be the only way in which the demand of pure communication, let me repeat this point because I think we lost it. Reacting against the abusive use of the expressivity of the naked body and innocent sex perpetuated by the new power, Pasolini intended to express and explore the unexpected possibility of making the language of the technological world expressive. This could be the only way in which the demand of pure communication made by production will somehow be countered and subverted. It is exclusively on the basis of such a possibility that even the future that now appears to us, to Pasolini at least, as fixation and death will be, in a new way, history. Let me just give you an example of this. Pasolini ingeniously identifies in De Sade, and especially the 120 Days, a literary model for this politicized aesthetics, a literary model in which communication is turned into expression by means of endless repetitions. In Sade, the infinite accumulation of bodies in orgies involved in a quasi-mechanical sexual act is expressive in a new way, Pasolini says. I quote, "Infinite accumulation is substituted for expressivity. Indeed, if the first piece of information a priest asks a child to urinate in his mouth is cold and inexpressive, the second is already less inexpressive, and the thousandth is not inexpressive at all. Inasmuch as accumulation is also reiteration, the effect achieved by De Sade is the mechanical but supremely expressive effect of litanies." Now, to conclude, does Pasolini really believe in this aesthetical political program as an only possible reaction to what is otherwise deemed to be an apocalyptic end of history in biopolitics? I think he does not believe in it. I think this remains an interesting aesthetical paradigm. I mean, I think what he says about De Sade is quite profound, but at the same time, this doesn't prevent us from telling us that the project of Salò was not only problematic but a failure, and to actually both endorse the critique of biopolitics in terms of critique of ideology that Pasolini put forward much earlier than other mainstream left-wing political thinkers, but also to warn us against the two temptations of radical humanism and radical anti-humanism. I mean, this is how I would finish here. Why did I choose to speak about Pasolini? Because you have a radical reversal from, you have the same critique of, you have the same stance, which is a Marxist Christian stance, heterodox Marxism, heterodox Christianity. So you have a consistent program throughout his work, from the, even like early 40s, like I go back to early 40s in poetry. Consistent stance on critique of ideology, which becomes in the late 60s an incredibly foreseeing and beautiful critique of biopolitics in particular. But at the same time, the question of the human and of humanism is not settled. So you move from radically humanist position with the exaltation of the aestheticization of the lumpen proletarian body to, which was also very discomforting in Italy. Accatone was banned initially because it basically banned. You don't get my English, right? So, yeah, it was banned initially. What I'm saying is that I was trying to show you how politically the anti-humanism of Pasolini is problematic, but nevertheless critically very strong in terms of critique of ideology. But I didn't want to underestimate, I didn't have time to go into that, how shocking even his radical humanism was. It was banned initially because of the juxtaposition of this story, which you know about. I mean, it's a story of a pimp and the sacred music. You know, like in the clerical Italy of the 50s, that was quite transgressive. So I'm not saying that the humanist Pasolini was not radical in his critique. But what I'm saying here, assuming, and I think a number of us would assume this, that actually what we have to carry out now in terms of critique of ideology is a critique of biopolitics, assuming that Pasolini is still able to teach us something, is also able to warn us against embracing anything which goes by the dichotomy between humanism and anti-humanism. So, last point I would say, humanism, anti-humanism, both are worse. We need a dialectics between the two.
Thank you very much. Very impressive retrospective. Now, Keti has the first question, and can someone give her the mic?
I have not so much the question, but a comment, maybe a couple of comments, concerning the corporeality exerted by the poor body that is by definition anti-bourgeois, whereas the victims, the poor victims of the Salon cannot resist but still go on in this bourgeois contract with their torturers, is the example from Accatone, the woman who voluntarily becomes the prostitute. The lady from extremely poor family, she's hired by Accatone to help him and just become a prostitute, earn money, and then she's in the car and she's unable to perform. So she wants to be a prostitute, but she's unable. So here he essentializes some kind of ethical stance, ethical anti-prostitution. Therefore, my argument would be that you juxtapose two Pasolinis. One Pasolini is kind of Western values, liberal, hedonistic, freedom of sex, liberation via sex.
Does it exist?
No, you poor bodies should not from now on go into sexual freedom, but rather the types of hedonism and the types of freedom that are circulated in capitalism, they don't allow these bodies to keep their anti-bourgeois stance. So he actually, my point is that he doesn't change. He's not believing even in the beginning that some kind of hedonism can be liberating. He just believes in some kind of poetic eros of
This is an important clarification. I didn't say that he does believe in hedonism, no. I mean, the poetry of the 50s is very clear. I mean, there's a beautiful poem where he actually has an attack, agape, attacking hedone. Hedone is never upheld.
Exactly. So he has this agape and hedone from the very beginning. So,
but it does change. You see, like, on the one hand, I agree with you. And I didn't say that he was
he changes
supporting hedonism before. But there is a programmatic change. I mean, these are the texts. Like, the duration is like saying, basically, everything I've done so far was totally wrong. There's also like an immense element of existential angst in the
Yeah, I agree with that, but it was wrong insofar as poverty, non-bourgeois bodies did not manage, and they failed to go on and continue this agape practice. So the proletarians stopped to be proletarians, not due to revolution, not due to emancipation that would terminate the bourgeois issues, but they stopped to be proletarians, they stopped to be poor in a wrong way. So the issue of emancipating from lower classes and the poverty is to emancipate from this
it's a very
from lower
class. It's a very straightforward Gramscian point, basically. It doesn't say that, but clearly it's a Gramscian point. The point is that everybody has become a bourgeois by means of hegemony, which didn't change the economy in the least. I mean, it's a very simplistic. I like Pasolini's analysis, not because it is very profound, but because it is so straightforward, you see. So the idea is that in a catone, not out of a specific ethic of the pimp, etc., the new form of political economy that was emerging in those years in Italy had not yet imposed a model able to hegemonize in a properly Gramscian sense through petit bourgeois culture. Whether this is really the case, historically, this is another question. I think it's quite convincing in Italy, the description. But I think at the end of the day, it's a kind of like apocalyptic form of Gramscianism.
Yeah, but let me specify, because it's important in terms of this pauperist issue, because Bifo wrote a radically anti-Pasolinian text where he asserts that exactly because of this belief and essentializing of the poor as some kind of noblesse, so the poor is de facto deprived of consumerism, de facto deprived of bourgeois corporeality. That's why it is noble. And it, in some utopian way, the poor can be the future communist. And Bifo says that this kind of communism and this kind of belief into some kind of crypto-communism of a poor person is very conservative, and it brings to Soviet-type bureaucratic KPRF idea, and it very easily shifts to the right-wing assertion of the poverty and belief in the lower classes, and therefore he completely denounces Pasolini and even says that Pasolini brought us to Berlusconi and Putin, and this is a very strong assertion.
Sure, I mean,
I don't share it at all.
Yeah,
I don't share it at all. I mean, my argument is somewhere in between. What I want to say that this issue of the poor life, which is existentially and ontologically already not performing the bourgeois values, is some kind of important ethical grain.
Sure.
And Pasolini is relying on it. And when this grain is lost in consumerism, he deplores it and rejects belief into this grain.
I mean, the rhetorical mode of Pasolini's political writing is very important. He was consciously a political provocateur. So his positions are very radical. Clearly, I have huge problems with his pauperism, even though I try to articulate what he is actually we could develop in new forms of pauperism. I've tried to develop that in a couple of papers, but the problem with pauperism in Pasolini is the aestheticization of the lumpenproletarian body or culture, which is more or less the same also geographically, you know, it's also applied to the Third World, etc., is very evident. What is not very evident is that, again, here Pasolini stands as the precursor of current Italian biopolitical thought, which is far less radical than people usually assume. So what about the last page of Negri's Empire? What is the only image you can find for Exodus and miscegenation? St. Francis and the Usus Pauper. What about Agamben? I mean, last few books and even going back to pauperism, Italian so-called radical political thought and pauperism are one thing. If you take like the main exponent, the problem is so clear in Pasolini that it becomes interesting. Whereas in Agamben's biopolitics, in Agamben's like sort of melancholic take on biopolitics, we are all fucked, etc., and then maybe Bartleby will save us all, something like that. On the other hand, with the euphoric biopolitics of Negri, total revolution, always already here, etc., etc., this theme of pauperism, which is very close to Italy for very clear sociological reasons. What? Well, because half of the population was Marxist, and at the same time they were also Catholic. So this kind of going back to St. Francis made existential. I'm just saying this is a debate which, again, Pasolini anticipates, and he can mark the problems of this debate. I'm not defending him in a much more clear fashion than contemporary so-called Italian radical thought.
But I would add one point. You blame him in being in accord with Negri, but I think Negri is much more in accord with Bifo because he uses the images of the poverty as some kind of metaphors. Nevertheless, in his chief argument, what is the most important thing in multitude and multitude precisely, is that he claims that the contemporary proletariat is not now relying on the issue of poverty. So this issue of having nothing to lose except your chains is evacuated from the Negrian argument in terms of contemporary proletariat, which is immaterial cognitive proletariat, and why it is proletariat, because it produces more surplus value. And the most poor and the most oppressed, they don't produce surplus value. So they don't have the, they are not connected with the general intellect. So I would say that here Negri and Pasolini would not be in one camp.
I dispute that because, again, I mean, the last page of Empire ends with St. Francis and the usus pauper. So I see your point and I agree. I mean, there is a tension. Yeah, I mean, this is like my more general take on. I mean, I wrote extensively on Italian current biopolitics, and my own general criticism is that it still relies profoundly on Christian ontology, and also on a certain leftist take, more specifically, of Catholic Marxist issues that were very widespread in the 50s and 60s, you know. And in this sense, again, it is propedeutic, if one is interested in Italian theory, especially abroad, to go back to Pasolini and see the tensions in Pasolini. Because there's still the kind of like, Pasolini lived existentially some of the implicit ontological tensions present in current biopolitical thought. That's my take.
Yeah, great. Frank? Mike?
Thanks, Lorenzo. This was great, and I very much endorse the idea of a dialectical relationship between the two extreme poles. I was wondering, could one also say what you presented is, because you started with the failed revolution of '68, right? I mean, which did not receive a name, and somehow couldn't one say what Pasolini, what you presented is like an analysis of a direct psychosomatic becoming renegade of the entire human race, without being, and this is the proper point, without being a revolutionary before. So you bypass, you circumvent being a revolutionary, and you directly go to renegadism. This would be one attempt of reformulating what you call anthropological genocide. So, and I mean, right? The failed revolution is somehow producing a universalized renegadism without revolution at all. And what then somehow one can see in the move from earlier to late Pasolini is a struggle how to get out of it. How to offer a proper analysis of renegadism, of direct renegadism without mediation, how to get out of it without weirdly returning to what failed in the beginning, without going back to '68, namely. I mean, and an analysis of what went wrong precisely. I mean, just like,
Yeah. No,
does that make sense?
Yeah, I generally agree. I would introduce just a complication. On the one hand, clearly, the failed revolution of '68 is the direct cause or the precipitating cause for anthropological genocide. Without '68, this total hegemonic grip of neo-fascism on culture at a very psychosomatic level would not have been possible. This is obvious. And that's also why, in a sense, Pasolini is so interested in terms of linguistic analysis to show the proximity between the rhetoric of the far left, lotta continua, potere operaio, etc., and the language of sociology, which is also for him the language of applied business. So on that level, I totally agree. The question of renegadism is a bit more complex because it can be applied to the cultural elites, that is to say, to the kids who actually protested in '68. And famously, Pasolini, he made this famous poem after the biggest clashes in '68 took place, where he said, "Yesterday night I sided with the policeman, not with you, because you are poor," again, pauperitas, poor children of southern migrants, and the policemen are poor children of southern migrants, and you are just spoiled kids, you know. And by the way, the character of Pietro in Teorema, if you read some of the interviews, is the failed '68 pseudo-revolutionary, the artist guy. And he believes he has emancipated himself because he has become an homosexual. This is also like a beautiful critique of queer theory in a way, you know, like, sure, '68 as such is the renegadism that sort of triggers the end of history, more or less. But in a way, and this is where it becomes interesting, there is still a kind of class struggle in that, actually lost class struggle for the proletariat or the lumpen proletariat. That is to say that the mass becomes criminal, as he says, especially from the lower classes, somatized ideological hooliganism, because of those bastards of '68. So you see the point. In a sense, like, there is no escape, and the problem then is how to get out of it, and he's not able to get out. And really, I worked on this some time ago, but the only proposal is the only constructive proposal is the aesthetical one I was, which is an interesting one, I was suggesting before about, through the SAD, but it's very little. So in a sense, he ends up with a total apocalyptic assessment, which is very problematic. But yes, remember that in a sense, anthropological genocide is caused by '68, but it's actually caused by the protesters, and the lower classes are the victims of that. And then, of course, in a sense, those victims become the conformist informers of Salon. It's a critique of the renegade. It's an ultra critique of the renegade.
I mean, with the consequence that after anthropological genocide, one is born a renegade, right? I mean, one's not born in innocence.
Exactly. Because of renegadism, innocence, corporeal, exotic, lower classes innocence, which was not a value, it was just a physical resistance, you know? And this explains a lot of films by Pasolini, where you have like these beautiful young kids, and they seem dull, they're not ethical subjects, but they have a kind of like force, an expression, I prefer expression, because otherwise you end up in vitalism, etc. But that kind of direct resistance, which was not politicized yet, but it was there, is obliterated by renegadism, yeah. And to go back to Keti's presentation, given that you talked about Teorema, I mean, Teorema is a metaphor of '68. I mean, it's the way in which the liberal bourgeoisie is unable to name the event of '68. Apart from the maid, so there's still like a gleam of hope, because she is Emilia, hence from the hearth, and the end finishes with a holy alliance between communist workers and religious sacrifice, etc., etc. But apart from her, all the others betray the guest, he says at one point. You know, all the other characters betray the event. They're not able to name it. And the point in Teorema also is like, if you think of what they do after he leaves, they try to repeat the event and to accumulate it. And again, the pseudo-artist is the worst, because what he wants to do is to possess the blue of the eye of the guest. I mean, this is a brutal critique of 68. And there are articles where he puts together the two.
Okay, some comments about what follows. I have a question, well, basically a clarifying question. You mentioned some things about the aesthetical ideas of Pasolini, that you need to replace this direct expressivity of naked bodies with some communicability, but this I didn't understand much more. What we all know about Pasolini is that, of course, he elaborated a very particular cinematographic style, and he is one of the greatest directors of the century, I think, because, of course, he has this very particular neutral gaze in his work. So you combine this kind of dramatic events that you depict and a very detached, neutral gaze, kind of God's gaze, which is, of course, there are theological references here. I'm not, well, this is similar to people like Kafka, maybe a little bit, or going to our time to the Russian director German, who inherited this style. What can we say here? We can say that this is some kind of resignation of which Keti spoke. This has certainly to do, at least in German also, with populism, because thank you, Keti, but I said populism. Народничество. Thanks for correcting me. And the idea in Pasolini, I think, is that you somehow lose yourself in the people. The people become some kind of Spinozian God, and therefore you can only look at it with a desubjectivized gaze. Maybe this. So what do you think about it?
No, I actually, I wanted to make like a specification about communication and expression, because I think you're inverting the two. No,
Sorry.
but I don't think there is any attempt at the mystical self-dissipation of the self. No, I don't
No?
think, no, I don't think even aesthetically there is such an idea of losing oneself at all. I don't think so. I mean, there is such a component as a component of subtraction, you know, like in a sense, like again, we go back to the void and the desert in Teorema. I mean, in a sense, like a loss of identity is needed before, in order to then construct something else. But I don't think there is such a...
So kenosis of a sort.
Sorry?
Kenosis?
I don't think there is, I mean, Pasolini doesn't have this even aesthetically endpoint in subtraction. I don't think so. Communication and expression, communication is, to very simplify, the bad side of language, and expression is the productive side of language.
Didn't get it.
So on the one hand, the idea is the idea of expression towards, through actually, metaphoric language, jokes, facial expressions, etc. Communication, on the other hand, is a kind of like a quasi-animalic sign to referent by unequivocal relation, according to Pasolini. And the idea here is that an anthropological genocide went together with a quasi-extermination of expressivity. So what he sees inside is a short circuit of expression and communication, which can be constructive. And what is the dialectical argument there? So if what was expressive in premise was the naked corporality and sex of young people of the lower classes, and this has been manipulated and falsified by the new hedonistic power, then expression by itself is no longer politically viable in aesthetic terms. So he's trying to find a form of expressionism or expressivism within sheer communication. You see, so...
This is Adorno.
Yeah.
The
In a way,
theory.
yeah. I mean, the fact that he doesn't choose ad is quite interesting. But all the linguistic considerations are widely relying on structural linguistics. I mean, maybe, of course, you know, like even im segno, the im he creates this term to talk about cinema, like a sign is an image sign. I mean, it's a pre-Deleuzian and post-Saussurian, you know. It becomes very, very linguistic. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, thank you very much, Lorenzo,
Thank you.
again.
Thank you.